So this video lecture is about Catholic-Franciscan ethics, and in this video lecture I want to do two basic things. So number one, I want to talk about the parts of John Mazzoni's chapter 5, describing Catholic-Franciscan ethics. I want to focus on the parts that are relevant to this class. And number two, I want to relate this chapter, and I want to relate the Franciscan way of life to Gabriel Marcel and this notion of an ethic of openness. So these two figures, Francis and Marcel, I see them as very closely linked. I see them as offering very similar worldviews. Okay, so John Mazzoni, in his 5th chapter, he talks about three major stories, very famous stories related to Francis. And I want to review those stories as well as some key principles, ethical principles that are offered by Professor Mazzoni. And in talking about these stories, I also want to again relate them back to Gabriel Marcel and this notion of an ethic of openness. All right, so the first story that Professor Mazzoni opens up with is the very famous nativity scene story. That could be considered Francis's most lasting legacy in this world. And it is, pretty profound and pretty amazing that what this guy did, in 1223, so nearly 800 years ago, lasts to this day. The nativity scene is a product of Francis, and he developed the live nativity scene. So what was the point of this? Why did he do this? Did he just want a kind of a nice postcard? Did he want a nice little Christmas tradition? For Francis, it was about recreating the conditions of Christ's birth as true to life as he could. So the animals, the smells, the poverty. He was not interested in sanitizing the scene, making it look prettier. He wasn't focused on Christ's divinity in this scene or Christ's great power. He wanted to bring his fellows, brothers and sisters, back to this moment of Christ's birth and back to the utter poverty, the filth, the kind of the marginalization that is associated with Francis being born in these conditions. And for Francis, why would he be so concerned about it? Well, part of the motivation here is to contrast the conditions of Christ's birth with what for Francis was a very kind of memorable moment in his young life, when the Empress was coming through his region of the country in a town nearby, and she gave birth to the future emperor. And it was what you would expect: big hoopla, big notoriety, people from all over coming in, all kinds of gifts, all kinds of attention paid to this birth. And that's fitting because this is the birth of a future emperor. And that is what is so profound about Christ being born. If you are a Christian, this is God, literally God, coming to be born into human form. And so you would expect, if the emperor, future emperor, get all this fanfare, and he's merely a worldly ruler, right? We don't even remember his name now. I mean, some historians do, but nobody in the general public does. Got all this attention for a figure, a person that will fade into oblivion eventually, and for most of us already has. Here you've got the literal ruler of the universe being born into human form, and there's nothing. There is no room for him at the inn, as the famous Christmas story goes. And so why is that so important? Well, for Francis, what it does is it brings us in touch with the humility in the incarnation, the humility of Christ, that God himself came down, born into these conditions, speaks to a profound humility. And what is the takeaway from that? Well, the takeaway is that you have somebody, you have this sense where no one is beneath God, regardless of your socio-political standing, regardless of how much money you have, regardless of how much power you have, regardless of how much renown you have, attention you have, fame you have, whatever it is. Here you have God in God's self born into these conditions, the lowest of the low. Think about as kind of an analogous example in today's world, somebody being born into the ghetto or something like that. Most people in society at large, would probably think, well, this is nothing. This is a nobody. This is somebody that's not going to amount to anything, or who really cares, that kind of stuff. And that's the kind of conditions into which Christ was born, a backwards town, the edge of the Roman Empire. Okay, so what do we take away from this? Well, one thing we, again, as I just mentioned, that we take away from it is that there is no one excluded from God's love. Your sociopolitical standing has nothing to do with your ability to experience God's presence in your life. And it also is a shout out to any of us that think we're important, or we have this kind of great significance because that's what people tell us in this world, that we're great, we're wonderful, we have all this power. We are, in the ultimate scheme of things, if God himself came down to be born in these conditions, we have to lower ourselves as well and recognize that we are one member of this human species, and that we're connected to every single member of this human species. And that is profound if you start to live that way, if you start to really radically live like you are no more important than anybody else. I mean, just think about, if you go into a retail store, or if you go into a fast food restaurant, how it is so easy to kind of look down upon people, the people that work there, and think we're so much better than them, or we've got so much more than them. And that's the kind of attitude that is incompatible and is contested by Christ's birth into these conditions. Now, related to Gabriel Marcel, related to this ethic of openness, there's that connection of the more we think we're important, the more we think we're above others, we're superior to, the less we are able to be open to their value, be able to open ourselves up to their significance, able to open ourselves up in terms of simply giving time to them. But if we take this Christ-centric view, then we are in a position where we can develop the kind of attitude where we are open to all of those that we encounter, whether they're the CEO, whether they're the janitor. Again, nobody is above us. Okay, so the second major story from the Franciscan tradition that is mentioned in John Mazzoni's chapter is the very famous story of the leper. You've heard this story, I'm sure, as part of your Newman education. And the significance of the leper is that the leper at that time was more or less a death sentence. Not only physically, like you could die from leprosy, and at those times you didn't know how it was transmitted, but you did know that it was a communicable disease. You did know that people that were in contact with lepers would be more likely to get leprosy. So you had this rotting away of your flesh. You had this kind of deterioration of your body. And, that in and of itself is horrific. But you also had this exclusion. You were ostracized. I mean, you were not going to be able to be a part of this community. And it makes sense. I mean, this was a dangerous condition that people didn't know anything about. It's not like they were being, radically cruel and kind of excluding or ostracizing the lepers, even though I'm sure people did it in a cruel manner at times. But it was used for protection. It makes sense. And certainly the leper is a threat and a danger, regardless of, the kind of just the aversion we would have to the leper because he or she would smell, he or she would look disgusting, things like that. And Francis, like most people of his day, was horrified and disgusted by lepers. But as we all know, Francis had this calling from God. He was compelled to kind of live as Christ. He was drawn to a radical form of Christianity. And so one of the pivotal moments of his life, perhaps the most pivotal, Franciscan scholars can debate that, but perhaps the culmination, you might say, of his conversion experience is when he sees this leper one day. He's riding his horse, and he gets off the horse, and he overcomes his fear. He overcomes his disgust with the grace of God, and goes down, meets the leper, embraces the leper, kisses the leper's hand. And at that moment, what happens, right? I mean, why is that significant? Well, it's significant because in order to be able to embrace the leper in that way, you have to let go of certain things. Number one, you have to let go of your plans, your goals, and even your life itself as the fundamental value by which you live. You have to live as if there is something more, something beyond this life. Because if this life is all we have, and if within this life, this one shot that we get, our goals, our desires, our agendas, what we value as most important, well, then the leper represents a threat to all of that. We would lose our friends, we would lose our body, we would lose our ability to do things. And so when we're thinking about our life in the context of this world, the leper is a tremendous threat. And so in order to embrace this world, you have to come to the point where you no longer place the outcomes of this world as most fundamental. Now, that's not to say that this world and this life doesn't matter. In fact, for Francis, it would matter quite a bit. It would matter because in this life, we are connected to God's creation, and we're all God's creatures. But the point is that if you embrace the leper, you have to say, all right, as much as I value this life, as much as I love this life, there is something more, there is something higher, there is something beyond it. And what is beyond it for Francis? Well, that's the love of God and the example of Christ. The literal willingness to love in a way that could bring you death. It's not that you seek out death, but you don't let death become a barrier to your ability to follow God's vocation, God's calling, God's will, the love of God. And so that's what Francis achieves in this embrace of the leper. It is profound in that sense that hardly any of us would do that. Hardly any of us would follow the will of God to the point that we put ourselves in a position to be ostracized, excluded, or even killed or die in some way. And so that letting go of this world, this agenda as being the most important, as being the ultimate, is again related to this idea of the ethic of openness in Gabriel Marcel. The more we restrict our objectives and our values and the importance of our life in terms of this world, the less we are able to reach out, the less we are able to kind of risk something in order to be open to others, in order to live out a life of love. Vice versa, the more we think that there is something beyond this world, there is something superior to it, the more we're willing to let go and put ourselves in a position where we are vulnerable to all kinds of dangers, all kinds of threats. But we do so in this openness to others, in this openness to the kind of the will of God. Now, in a very similar way, we have Francis's famous journey to the Sultan. And here we have a situation where Francis is going to the enemy of Christianity. He's going to an Islamic ruler, and the Muslims and the Christians at that time were at war. They were battling. So literally going to the enemy, literally going to a person who would have been responsible for killing Christians and Christian death, and vice versa. Obviously, the Christians were killing the Muslims as well. But the idea here is that at that time, this is a guy who is a fundamental enemy of the world and the communities from which Francis comes. And so he obviously risks death in this journey. And so in the same way that I was talking about the leper, the decision to journey to go meet the Sultan is a decision to place something superior to this life, to live as if there is something more. But there's also the threat of kind of the ostracism as well. Same thing with the leper with regard to that. But a final point, I think that we can develop this in a little bit of a different way, is the notion of forgiveness, right? I mean, think about how we hold grudges. Think about how when someone wrongs us, we oftentimes can't let that go. We dwell on it. And certainly we're not going to embrace that kind of person. Now, while part of the mission of Francis to go to meet the Sultan is conversion, part of it is this ability, this willingness, both by Francis and the Sultan, right? Because obviously from the Sultan's point of view and the Muslim community that was in conflict with the Christians at that time, they would have felt very aggrieved, very wronged by the Christians. This ability to kind of forgive, to move on, to not let our anger, our hatreds, the wrongs done to us, to not let them be a barrier to our ability to come into some kind of meaningful relationship with others. And again, you can see how this is going to relate to this notion of an ethic of an openness. Think about how grudges can separate people. Grudges can keep us away from people. Vice versa, this ability to kind of let go of grudges opens us up to others, opens us up to the possibility of forgiveness, opens us up to the possibility of reconciliation. And so that's part of why this journey to the Sultan is so important from the Franciscan point of view. Another thing I'll kind of say here about Francis, not necessarily in the Mazzoni book, but this notion of brothers and sisters, this notion that all of creation is our brother and sister, brother death, sister tree, brother moon, sister disease, brother flower, whatever it is, right? In one sense, we can look at that and say, this is just a stupid way of talking. I mean, like, this is just ridiculous. It's childlike or something like that. But I think in the more profound sense, why this kind of language is so significant is because it reminds us that we really radically are connected, and that creation itself is a gift from God of which we get a chance to partake. And I had this experience one fall. I was raking my leaves out in the lawn, and, I was kind of getting annoyed because I had other things to do. I wanted to move on. I had to kind of do this job. And again, I was kind of annoyed, frustrated, whatever you want to call it. And then I just kind of realized, I was like, here I am letting my agenda, my goals, like, the leaves were annoying. Raking them up was annoying because I had other things that I had to do. And so, just like kind of Gabriel Marcel, there's a kind of Franciscan sense of, when I let go of focusing on what I need to do, when that no longer becomes the most important thing in the world. Now, it's important, right? Because we have jobs to do in this world, we have roles to play, so on and so forth. We have goals, so on and so forth. But when we let go of that as most fundamental, we become open to the possibility that, look, all of what surrounds us is a gift from God, and we can take a moment to appreciate it. Instead of being annoyed by raking those leaves, I can be open up to the possibility, well, look, there's something, an opportunity to be out here on a beautiful day, to clean my lawn, to manicure it, and to recognize just the kind of the beauty that surrounds me, including those leaves, which I am raking up. But if I'm focused on me and my agenda and what I have to do, that kind of opportunity passes. And the language of brother and sister helps to remind us that, look, regardless of what I want to do, regardless of my plans, my objectives, I'm connected to creation in this kind of radical way. And I should, as much as possible from a Franciscan and a Marcellian point of view, open myself up to this creation, open myself up to the goodness of it. Get myself out of the way so I can appreciate this goodness. Now, the final thing I want to kind of do is there's a couple, 4 principles that Mazzoni emphasizes in this chapter 5, and I just want to mention them because they are ethical principles that we can use to help understand not only the Franciscan Catholic tradition, but we can use them to help us solve ethical dilemmas and work through, the questions that face us. One, so this is all on page 69 of the second edition of John Mazzoni's Catholic and Franciscan Ethics, the first edition, my fault. The first principle here is the personalist principle, which says that, quote, the human person is made in the image of God and has the dignity that ought to be respected, end quote. Okay, so again, this notion that the human person, not particular kinds of human beings, not only certain persons, it's not based upon what you do, but the human person, each and every person has this dignity as a gift from God, as being made in the image and likeness of God. And again, when we think about it like that, when we think about that commonality, that allows us to open ourselves up to a whole range of people that we might not otherwise open ourselves to. Principle of charity. We should love God and love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And this is also kind of the golden rule, the principle of the golden rule. So this notion of loving God, first and foremost, that's the first kind of objective, love of God. Because if we don't love God, we fall into a position of idolatry. And one could even say that is perhaps the most common and fundamental sin. And it's the kind of sin, if we would look to the Augustinian tradition, that you could call its own punishment. We idolize something when we act as if something in this world is itself a god. And so the principle of charity that reminds us that love of God comes first is a way to kind of combat that temptation. Because again, I think that the notion of idolatry is really profound. It's widespread. I mean, it's each and every one of us that is an idolater in some way. And what is the sign of idolatry? Well, think about what keeps you up at night. Think about what worries you. Think about what it is that you're pulling your hair out. Think about what it is that stresses you. There's a certain point at which we could say that's what we devote ourselves to. Think about whatever major you're in. And if you can't sleep at night, if you are, becoming unhealthy because of the stress associated with that major, you can ask yourself why. I mean, look, perhaps you fail. Perhaps it doesn't work out. Perhaps that's not the path for you. But we're in a situation of idolatry. We think, well, this is what must happen. This is the only good that is good for me. This is the good that I must sacrifice everything else for. It's also kind of a form of egotism. This is what I must have. And, I put it in the context of academics because obviously you are all in school, but it could be anything. It could be what neighborhood you live in, what house you ultimately want, losing sleep, getting anxious, getting jealous because you don't have the house that you want. That's a form of idolatry. That's putting that kind of materialism, that desire for possession, making it your God. And when you make that your God, all these other bad things happen. This sense of insecurity, the sense of jealousy, the sense of never having enough. All of that comes when we forget that principle of charity, that principle that we must make the love of God first. Finally, there is the principle of the preferential option for the poor. And so that principle essentially says we need to attend to those who are especially in need, such as lepers, first. Like that should be where we put our eggs and the eggs in the basket, so to say. That's where we should make the first move. Who is it that is really suffering? Who is it that is really marginalized? Who is it that is really poor? Those are the kind of people that we ought to give preference to in terms of our assistance, in terms of our ability to give, in terms of our time and our energy and our resources. Not that they're all that matters, right? It's not like you should spend all your time giving to the poor or something like that, the poor, the needy, the marginalized. But they come first. And again, that makes sense based upon the Franciscan stories that John Mazzoni talks about in this chapter and that I've talked about in this lecture. So, just to kind of sum up, the Catholic-Franciscan tradition, I think we can gain insight into the life of Francis, the basic values of Francis, through the three stories that John Mazzoni discusses in his book. All of those examples relate very heavily to this ethic of openness, to this project of kind of diminishing our ego so that we can be open to the needs and the desires and the goodness of others. In the same way, this notion of brothers and sisters is very much related to this idea of connecting ourselves to creation, getting out of our own ways. And then finally, the principles that I mentioned, foundational from a Catholic Franciscan tradition. And again, they also are very important in terms of helping us understand this project of becoming more open to the goodness and the value, not only of other persons, not only of ourselves, but of creation more generally.